Cobwebs draped across the handles, the wooden grips cracked and gray with age. Shoved into the back corner of a Nebraska barn sale, half buried under a stack of old fence posts, sat a plow nobody had bothered to move in years. A masking tape price tag curled off one handle. $2. Yes, this really happened. A 19-year-old walked through that barn sale, spotted the plow, and paid $2 for it. Nobody there, including him, had any idea what he'd just picked up. Comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. Jake Mercer hadn't planned on buying anything that Saturday morning. He'd tagged along with his uncle, who was hunting for a specific set of hand tools rumored to be somewhere in the sprawling barn sale spread across a retiring farmer's property outside Kearney. 19 years old, working weekends at a small engine repair shop, Jake had a habit of picking up old broken mechanical pieces not because he needed them, but because he liked figuring out how things used to work before modern replacements made the old designs obsolete. Wandering past tables of canning jars and stacked lumber, he noticed the plow leaning against the back wall of the barn, mostly hidden behind a pile of rusted fence posts nobody had thought worth sorting through. Most of the wood on the handles had grayed and cracked from decades of exposure, and the metal blade was pitted with rust so deep it had eaten small holes clean through in a few spots. Something about its shape caught his attention anyway. Kneeling down for a closer look, he ran his hand along the frame, brushing away enough dirt to reveal faint lettering stamped into the metal near the base, a manufacturer's mark he didn't recognize. Worn nearly smooth, but still legible enough to make out a few letters and part of a number sequence. He asked the woman running the sale table about it, and she shrugged, telling him it had been sitting in that barn longer than she'd owned the property. $2 if you want to haul it off, she said, clearly more interested in clearing barn space than negotiating price on farm junk nobody else had touched all morning. Jake paid on the spot, wrestled the plow into the bed of his uncle's truck, and didn't think much more about it until he got it home that evening and set it up under better lighting in his garage. That's when the proportions started nagging at him. The blade's curve looked different from every other antique plow he'd seen at farm shows over the years, narrower, angled in a way that seemed almost experimental rather than standard production. Grabbing his phone, he photographed the stamped lettering as clearly as he could manage, along with a few close-ups of the blade's unusual shape, planning to look into it once he had a free evening. He had no idea that decision was about to lead him somewhere far beyond a weekend restoration project. A few nights later, Jake finally sat down with his laptop and the photos still saved on his phone, typing the partial lettering into a couple of antique farm equipment forums just to see if anyone recognized the manufacturer. He expected, at most, a rough guess at the decade it was made. Instead, 2 separate replies came back within a day, both saying the same thing: that lettering sequence didn't match any common manufacturer they could place with confidence. One reply came from a retired agricultural history professor who ran a small blog cataloging obscure farm equipment manufacturers from the early 20th century. He asked Jake to post additional photos, specifically close-ups of the blade's curvature and the mounting bracket where it attached to the frame. Something about Jake's description had clearly caught his attention in a way Jake didn't fully understand yet. Before we get to what that professor found, hit subscribe, because what happened over the next few days turned a $2 barn sale plow into something this 19-year-old never saw coming. The professor's response, once Jake sent the additional photos, came back noticeably more detailed and urgent than his first message. He explained that a small handful of experimental plow designs had been developed and tested on private farms in the early 1900s before the manufacturers behind them either merged, went bankrupt, or abandoned the design entirely in favor of standardized production models that dominated the market for decades afterward. Records on these experimental units were scarce, largely because so few had ever left the farms where they were first tested. Jake sat in his garage, phone in hand, still not entirely convinced this wasn't some exaggerated internet rabbit hole. But the professor wasn't finished. He asked for one more photo, a specific spot on the underside of the frame, near where the blade connected to the main beam, an area most casual buyers would never think to examine closely. Flipping the plow over and wiping away decades of dried mud with a rag, Jake found it. A small, nearly illegible stamped plate bearing a partial patent number, something he hadn't noticed in any of his earlier photos. He captured a clear image and sent it off, expecting another polite reply about historical curiosity. Instead, his phone rang within the hour. It was the professor, and his opening words were, "I need you to send me everything you have on this piece, right now." Sitting on an overturned bucket in his garage, phone pressed to his ear, Jake listened as the professor explained what that patent number actually represented. It matched a design filed by a small Midwest manufacturer in 1911, one of only a handful of prototype plows built to test a blade curvature meant to reduce soil compaction, and innovation considered ahead of its time, but ultimately abandoned when the company folded during an economic downturn just 2 years later, before the design ever reached full production. As far as documented history goes, the professor said, there are only 2 of these confirmed to still exist anywhere. One sits in a small agricultural museum in Illinois. The other one may be sitting in your garage right now. Jake didn't respond right away. He just stared at the rusted, cracked-handled plow he'd hauled home for $2 less than a week earlier, still parked exactly where he'd left it. The professor kept explaining, walking Jake through why a piece like this carried real value among serious agricultural history collectors, not because of its function, since the design had never been mass-produced or widely used, but because of its documented rarity and its place in the broader story of early 20th century farming innovation. Prototype agricultural equipment from failed manufacturers, he explained, often told a more interesting story than the machines that succeeded, precisely because so few examples ever survived long enough to be studied. Then came the estimate. Based on recent private sales of comparable prototype-era agricultural equipment, and factoring in this piece's rarity and its traceable patent history, the professor placed its value somewhere between $18,000 and $28,000, with the potential to climb higher once fully authenticated and properly restored. $18,000 to $28,000 for a plow he'd paid $2 for behind a pile of fence posts nobody else had bothered to move. Jake asked if the professor was certain. The answer was careful but confident. Full certainty would require authentication through metallurgical testing and cross-referencing against the original 1911 patent filing, but the stamped plate, the blade's unusual curvature, and the overall construction all matched everything documented about this specific abandoned design. In over 20 years of researching obscure agricultural history, the professor admitted he'd only ever seen photographs of the one surviving museum piece. He never expected a phone call about a second one turning up in someone's garage. For the first time since loading it into his uncle's truck, Jake looked at the plow completely differently. It wasn't scrap metal anymore. It was a documented piece of agricultural history that had somehow survived over a century of neglect, $2, and a barn sale table that almost sent it to a scrapyard. Word spread quickly once Jake posted an update on the same forum where he'd first asked about the lettering. Within days, 2 additional agricultural history specialists reached out, both wanting to examine the plow in person before anything moved forward publicly. Rather than rushing to sell, Jake made the same decision the professor had gently encouraged, sending the piece for full authentication before entertaining any offers at all. Weeks of research followed. Metallurgical testing confirmed the frame's composition matched materials commonly used by small manufacturers in the early 1910s. The professor cross-referenced the stamped patent number against archived filings and found a near-exact match to the original 1911 patent documentation, filed by a manufacturer that had folded within 2 years of the plow's production. Piece by piece, what began as an offhand $2 purchase became a fully documented, verified prototype, one of only 2 known to still exist. Local news in Nebraska eventually picked up the story, drawn to the almost unbelievable gap between what Jake paid and what the plow turned out to be worth. Jake ultimately chose restoration over an immediate sale, working alongside the professor's recommended specialists to stabilize the piece for display while preserving as much of the original material as possible. Early estimates on the fully restored, authenticated plow climbed past the initial appraisal range, with at least one regional agricultural museum expressing serious interest in acquiring it for permanent display. What sticks with people who hear this story isn't just the dollar figure, though that part certainly grabs attention. It's how close the plow came to disappearing entirely. If Jake had walked past that corner of the barn, if he'd skipped the photos, if that retired professor hadn't taken the time to ask a few more questions, that plow likely ends up scrapped for parts within the year. Its history erased along with it. Barn sales and estate sales across the country are full of moments like this, hiding in plain sight behind stacks of fence posts and forgotten tools, priced by people who have no idea what they're actually looking at. Most of the time, nothing comes of a hunch like Jake's. This time, $2 and a little curiosity uncovered a piece of agricultural history nobody expected to find. $2. One overlooked plow. One phone call that changed everything. Jake's story proves the next great find could be sitting in a barn nobody's checked in years. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more real discoveries where ordinary people stumbled onto extraordinary finds.